Hola, benvinguts de nou al canal. Avui estrenem una segona entrevista amb el filòsof Simon Critchley, que va néixer a Liverpool però dona classe a Nova York, a la universitat on jo vaig fer el doctorat, de fet, i per tant va ser professor meu. És el professor més conegut, més popular, més pop, si voleu, del departament. Escriu al New York Times de manera habitual i dirigeix un blog de filosofia, escriu a tot de mitjans, i tot i que ha publicat llibres, diguem-ne, pròpiament filosòfics i articles acadèmics, també s'ha atrevit a anar a d'altres camps. Té un llibre sobre David Bowie que va ser molt celebrat. Ha escrit molt sobre futbol, busca en el futbol la metàfora per altres reflexions. Em sembla que va ser arrel de la traducció d'un llibre sobre futbol que va venir a Barcelona darrerament i va fer una conferència al CCCB. És una persona molt pedagògica, amb una actitud molt professoral, i en aquesta entrevista ha estat molt generós, diguem-ne, ha reflexionat en viu. Li he preguntat bàsicament dues coses. Una, si això de la pandèmia creu ell que ens canviarà molt, tant els sistemes polítics com la nostra manera de viure al món. I després li pregunto per una contradicció. Darrerament ha publicat dos articles, un al New York Times, que l'ha publicat l'Ara també recentment en català, i un en LA Review of Books, que el va publicar en espanyol, una web de filosofia també. I en l'article del New York Times diu que la filosofia és molt important perquè ens ajuda a morir millor, i per tant a viure millor, i ens fa menys esclaus, mentre que l'altre article diu el contrari, que la filosofia no serveix per res i que a més li hagués valgut ser perruquer. Li pregunto si la seva tasca serveix d'alguna cosa, si les idees que maneguem serveixen d'alguna cosa, si les reflexions que podem posar sobre la taula serveixen d'alguna cosa o no. I de manera molt generosa ell desenvolupa aquestes idees intentant buscar una solució i ens porta a camins insospitats. Espero que us agradi. So thank you, Simon Critchley, for joining us in this set of joining me. I don't know why I say us in this set of interviews. Simon Critchley is a philosopher from Liverpool who teaches at the New School for Social Research, where I pursued successfully my PhD. So full disclosure, he was my professor. Actually, today, as we speak, the article you published in the New York Times has been published by a Catalan newspaper in Catalan. And I want to talk about that article a little bit. I actually would like to talk about a couple of things, just a couple of things. One is the contrast between the article you published in the New York Times and the article you published in the LA Review of Books. I don't know if there's a material contradiction or performative contradiction between those articles. But we'll talk about that a little later. I just want to ask you just a very simple question. There seems to be two main schools right now in the press when philosophers or economists or political scientists talk about the consequences of this quarantine or lockdown or pandemic. There seems to be two main schools. One that says everything is going to change, and the other one says everything is going to be the same. We are exaggerating. We're in the midst of this crazy stay-at-home life, and therefore we believe things are going to change, but they are not going to change. So intuitively, in which school are you in right now? Is everything going to change or nothing is going to change?
I think everything is going to change a little bit, so it's not going to change that much. So kind of between both schools, I think things are going to, the period of peak globalization is, I think, over. I think there are serious implications for what's going on for not just the economy in terms of people's livelihoods, so that's important, but in terms of supply chains, where things are made, how things are distributed. Because here in New York, there's been a shortage of masks and ventilators and basic apparatus because decisions were made to produce all of that in China. And so I think that kind of period of globalization is, not that it's over, but I think that's going to raise questions about how we've organised things. I think that what do I think is going to change? I think more the reactions to, and this might be an interesting question in relationship to Catalonia, because the part of the reaction to things has been kind of Hobbesian, in the sense in which, I mean, you know, Hobbes's Leviathan, the basic argument is that the what the citizen can expect of the sovereign, the government, the person that leads, is security and protection, and that's the basic contract: security and protection. And what we've found is that people have, particularly in the European context, have fallen back within their national borders. There's not been a policy, but suddenly the European Union seems to be kind of abstract and irrelevant. It doesn't really seem to be the way people are thinking about issues of public health. That in this situation, people are thrown back on the nation as a basic unit of political reality, and that's bad, I think, for the most part. And obviously, in somewhere like Spain, it's problematic in different ways. But I think that it reveals that we still, at some level, we still expect that government will protect us, has a duty to protect us, and when that duty is not observed, then we can feel legitimately outraged. So I think that's a kind of an old feeling that people have, but that's kind of resurfacing. And what else do I think?
You mentioned three things. Let me stop you there for a second and try to delve into those three things. You said hyper-globalization seems to be over. There's another way to put this, which is like liberal capitalism is bust. This is something John Gray said in the article you recommended to me over email in the New Statesman. And I don't know how that looks like, but in the long term, but in the short term, it looks like we are all going to suffer some sort of economic crisis that will be harder than we have experienced so far, clearly harder than 2008. So I don't know how we adjust.
That's kind of hard to imagine. And that was hard enough, right?
Yeah. Second, the Hobbesian test, right? Seems like the issue of security has become, again, the issue of our politics. It happened after 9/11, in a way. We accepted several things that were unimaginable before. Let's say we accepted that before we board a plane, we need to prove to some guy with a uniform that we don't have a bomb in our shoes, which is, it's pretty hard if you think about it abstractly. I don't know if this will lead to a situation in which, say, to get a job, you will have to show that you are healthy or that you are not infected with whatever, or
maybe you will,
these kind of things. It seems to me,
maybe to have, if you're single and you want a relationship, you have to show a kind of a clean, show an immunity certificate or something like that. Yeah, that's possible. Or to get on a plane, to get on a flight. I think almost certainly there'll be some kind of electric thermometer which will check your temperature. And yeah, sure. I mean, this raises deep questions. Yeah.
The Hobbesian test, the idea that the state has to protect you. I think we're experiencing some sort of, I don't know how to put this, and I don't know how to think about this, but it seems as if we have forgotten that the basis of our system is not so much that people cannot die until they are 90. the basis of our system is the opposite, is that we accept risk in exchange for personal freedom. We drive cars. We know that many people die of car crash every year. We don't, stop people from driving. We create laws that make it maybe, hard, more difficult for people to die of a car crash, but still we accept that. And suddenly now we're saying it's unacceptable that people are dying. Of course, it's people we can save, and our goal is to avoid the collapse of the healthcare system. In the UK, you were mentioning the UK before we started this conversation, and the slogan, the motto they are using is explicitly "save the NHS." It's not "save the people" or "save lives." It's just "save the system," right? It's "save this." But it seems to me that if people start accepting the idea that the government has to protect our lives, at all costs, those all costs are very high. It implies privacy. It implies intimacy. It implies like our phones, the way we live, our medical records, our ability to pursue a life that the government cannot control. And I don't know if we are too fearful that we are willing to accept that now and we're going to regret it later. This is not a question. It's just
I hear what you're saying. I think the part of me thinks that if we really cared about personal freedom, if that really was an issue, then we wouldn't have cell phones. We wouldn't be walking around with these surveillance machines which can basically track where we are and where we've been over what is now a period of very many years for many of us. We choose this. We choose to, we think that we're concerned with our personal freedom, but we don't seem to act on that. We seem to value something else. We seem to value a sense of security, a sense of protection. And the one thing I was thinking about last weekend, which was just kind of amusing but interesting, was that in somewhere like the United Kingdom, the function of the church, it was Easter weekend. So Easter weekend last weekend, this rather important celebration in the Christian calendar, which wasn't being celebrated in any churches, and the function of the church has become the function of the health service. So the health service has kind of replaced the church as something in which we believe, right? So there's the only public expressions of belief, of faith that we seem to have now, certainly here in New York and in the UK, are these rituals of applauding and cheering for health workers, and then so that's become a kind of almost theological core to how we imagine our life in society. And then the genius of Boris Johnson was to almost die in the week of before Easter, and then to be on Easter Sunday, not Christ is risen, but Boris is risen. So Boris within the church, which is now the National Health Service, right, is kind of reborn as this new man that has kind of seen the light, been saved by nurses. Of course, those nurses are from other countries; they're foreigners, and so I think there's a kind of a strange kind of theological conversion story there, which is interesting. I think it's very, again, thinking of Britain, which is just because that's where I'm from, and it's because it's gone through this whole drama of Brexit in the last few years. The way in which this idea of belief has become focused on a figure like Johnson, and also the fact that what's happening in terms of actual social and economic policy is socialism, right? That a conservative government in the United Kingdom has basically renationalised the railways and poured huge amounts of money into the economy, and is engaged in the most socialistic economic intervention, which would have been unimaginable, a few months ago. And so that's kind of interesting that somehow that is what's expected. So, that somehow in somewhere like Britain, capitalism has been shown to be bankrupt when it comes to dealing with a situation like this, and therefore there needs to be significant state intervention. So things are kind of upended and back to front, I think, at the moment, to say the least.
You mentioned the fact that we all accept that our phones are being tracked by companies and apps and all that. I've been hearing a lot about this lately, and it sounds to me somehow like the boiling frog argument, right? That we've been, slowly being boiled. The temperature of the water is raising, and then when it's too late, you said, "Oh, you should not be in this pot if you didn't want to be boiled."
Right. Yeah.
But it also looks to me like the fundamental belief of the people in general. People believe in their epoch, in the sense that if something was wrong, they would be told about it. Like if suddenly the sun was revolving around the earth and not the other way around, somebody would tell us, right? So you can trust your epoch and whatever. In that sense, I think even though we accept that our phones are being tracked and all that, in a minimal sense, we trust our institutions to tell us if something wrong, was being done with our data.
We want to trust that. We want that trust. We want to believe that there are institutions which have our interests at heart. I think this situation has revealed that very strongly. In the United States, given that the Trump administration has not done that, I live in New York and therefore in New York State, and there's been a significant increase in the popularity of Andrew Cuomo because he seems to have people's interests at heart. He's doing the kind of job that people imagine that a leader does in a situation like this. People are scared. People are frightened. And in this situation of fear, we want to believe that someone is looking out for us, looking after us, and so I think that's a deep.
But at the same time, I think we all know at an intuitive level, maybe, that if the government had the power to track our phones explicitly, another thing if the NSA does it, but explicitly, like in the face, then the temptation to have a society in which control is everything, it's too tempting to resist for any politician or any party or institution. And that's why I think it's one thing to have Google knowing your preferences in YouPorn, and a different thing for the government to know where were you last Tuesday instead of being quarantined in your home. Maybe you were conspiring with your friends at the new school against the government, say. It was surprising when I saw the New Jersey order for a stay-at-home period. It made several exceptions. And one exception was just a little bit of sport. You can, go outside and walk a bit, which is something you cannot do here. in Spain.
You can't.
No, my kids have been 33 days at home without, stepping outside, even for 1 minute.
I didn't know that you're totally, you can't go out at all. The kids.
Just for buying food and
Wow.
and those things. Exceptions in New Jersey. So one was that. Second was for religious reasons, and third was for political reasons. Those three things. And I thought, well, this is America, right? You cannot ask people, to stay at home in a pandemic if they have a political, reason to be outside.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's, again, I don't know if we're losing something in this period, some basic understanding of our, political agency that we're giving up just because, the fear of death is stronger than anything else in our lives, at least when it comes to the forefront of our imagination. But
yeah, I mean, we're giving up. We are giving up. I mean, we'll see what happens. It's I think that if we think about the places where there's more sophisticated tracking of citizens, the development of artificial intelligence, facial recognition technology, say in China, where clearly, so when the coronavirus was first reported, and then there was the lockdown in Wuhan, and the feeling I remember having then was, wow, they can really do that. They can shut down a city of 11 million people like that. They can just kind of cut this place off. This is the Detroit this is the Turin of China, and they can lock that whole place down. That would never happen here. And yet, 2 months later, something quite similar has happened in New York. This kind of bastion of liberal capitalism. The whole thing has just ground to a halt, and it's hard for me to imagine that this is going to lead to. It might lead to greater authoritarianism. So what this period in history might lead to is new forms of authoritarian control. On the other hand, another thing that's very interesting about this situation is that our lives have changed because of a virus, and a virus that transformed from a bat to a pangolin to a kind of anteater that's sold in markets in Wuhan, if that is indeed where the transmission began. This novel virus has fundamentally reshaped reality, and that shows the kind of defenselessness of human behavior with regard to that. So governments can't stop that. Nobody can stop that. You could imagine living on an island where there would be no movement in and out of that island, and therefore there'd be no cases of the novel virus. But at some point in the future, someone would arrive from somewhere else, and they would maybe bring that virus. But the situation that we're in now, 400,000 people arrived from China into the United States in the period between the original detection of the virus and the travel ban. And so there's a kind of, we find ourselves in a kind of reminded of the fact that we are these weak, fragile, porous creatures. We're these dependent, weak creatures, and no government can't really do anything about that, and we can't. We can try to protect ourselves, but also with the knowledge that we probably have it, and maybe we were asymptomatic, or if we don't have it, we will have it, because we're in. It's the 16th of April, Thursday the 16th of April, or Friday the 17th of April with you, and on the best case scenarios, there'll be a vaccine in a year to 18 months. So life is going to be like this, some version of this, for the next year and a half. I think that's that's interesting to me and worrying, but it's also interesting that we could look at the things that we did, day to day, like going to a restaurant, going to a bar.
Well, it could go either way, because maybe the result will be a more prophylactic way of living, like not touching other people, not going to the movies or restaurants, or it could be the other way around. It could be a more vitalistic Nietzschean take on life and say, well, since a virus is invisible and could be anywhere, it could, I could die tomorrow. Maybe now it's the time to have that affair that I didn't have before, or that.
I like barebacking during AIDS, right? Okay, yeah. We could be like that in a situation of generalized barebacking. So barebacking is really because people, the gay community, and knew that there was AIDS, it was killing people, and people just thought, "Fuck it, I'm gonna take a risk," and you kind of enjoy that risk, almost, pornographically enjoy it. So I think, there could be. I think that reaction. I think over the summer that could happen. I think people will, at a certain point, will think, no more of this. This is enough, and I don't care. I think that's also going to be generationally structured. So now there's this, this argument which. It depends context by context, but we have to be wear masks, or I have to wear. We all have to wear masks because we have to think about the generational transmission of this virus. I'm 60 years old. I'm a possible subject of this, but I know people that are 80 years old that are more at risk. So if you're 25 years old and living in New York and it's summer and it's hot, you might think, well, I don't care. I'll just do what I want, and to hell with the consequences. And if I kill someone, then I kill someone. That might be a reaction, much more kind of nihilistic reaction.
Well, there's a competition of goods, of course. One is a 25-year-old, which is probably the most self-centered. But say kids are not going to school. For many families, school, and for many kids, school is safety, is food. School is not being abused at home. School is not being, sentenced to whatever level of education your parents had. The more time you spend at home, the more you reproduce the patterns of your family, right? Mm-hmm. Or if you're a single mom with 2 kids, or you are the provider, you don't need to be single. Unless you can go to work, you can see a world in which the opportunities of your children are, less bright. And the life of someone who's 80 is very important from a Kantian perspective, right? It's very important because it's the dignity of the human being and autonomy. But there's a good in competition here, right? There's the good of a family, of economic survival, of psychological survival, or physical survival for kids who are trapped in, horrible homes. And it's not clear how. I was having a conversation last week with a bioethicist about these things, about how we decide to whom do we give a ventilator in a case of an emergency, right? And I was asking her, well, this same kind of decisions, the structure of the decision is not that different from a political decision of, well, are we protecting 75-year-olds? Are we protecting 85-year-olds? Or maybe the longer this lasts, by protecting 85-year-olds, we are unprotecting 5-year-olds.
Yes.
It's not, we don't have cultural tools to make these decisions as of now.
I mean, we're all in a situation of a kind of, I think what someone's referred to, I read somewhere, as a soft utilitarianism. There's maybe a benevolent utilitarianism. Let's say those doctors in Lombardy, in northern Italy, that they seem to be good doctors, and it's a very rich and rich part of Italy, and let's imagine all those doctors are benevolent souls, but they're having to make a triage, a very utilitarian choice between, if somebody comes into a hospital and they're 80 years old and let's say they had a lung transplant, or they've got a pre-existing condition, they come in and they're not maybe showing many symptoms, they're talking about the problems that they're having, but they're just not feeling very well. That person comes in and you've decided that they will not receive help. They will not, they'll not get a ventilator. They will not be intubated or resuscitated, because you have to wait for the 30-year-old or 40-year-old or 50-year-old that's coming into the hospital who could be saved. So I think doctors are making those choices right now in Brooklyn. They are making those choices, and I think to make those choices, they're having to kind of immunize themselves against a moral sentiment, immunize themselves against that Kantian position that he's a human being who has rights and deserves dignity. In a sense, you have to suspend that in order to get through this nightmare. And awful choices have to be made. With kids, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think it's, I don't have that problem. And my son is 27 and in England, and my stepson is here at 16. And so with young kids, I'd find that very difficult.
But I don't have that problem either, because I'm middle class. I have tools at home. I can we can survive. I know maybe there are going to be some psychological consequences of being locked down for a long time, but I don't think my family or families like mine are the issue here. I could endure a year of homeschooling and we would manage. But not everybody has a balcony like I do. Not everybody has a house like I do, or books or whatever, right? Or internet. And I don't know. You said something earlier that made me think. You said it looks like national sentiment is on the rise, because what we're doing,
we fall back into it. We've not really thought about it, but this situation has arisen, and we want some reassurance, and the only kind of framework that we have seems to be the national framework. Right? We're just falling back on that, whether we're Danish or.
Yeah, it's clear we're doing a collective effort, right? We're staying at home. We're very, we're complying with what we're told, and even John Gray, I think, said something about, it seems like we use national sentiment to make those efforts, but universal humanity, or it's not something that mobilizes our moral sentiment enough to say, okay, I'll do this for the sake of humanity. We don't do that. We say, I do this for the sake of my neighbor, or I do this for the sake of my compatriot. I don't know. And when we started emailing for this interview, I said to you, we should read this paper by Rorty. I don't want to go deep into it, but he says something that I think is relevant to this argument, which is, he says, we tend to think of justice as a conflict between loyalty and universal justice. And we tend to say, if a family member were to knock on our door and say, I've been accused of a hideous crime of which I'm guilty, and the police is after me, please hide me. Let's say it's your mother or your son. You would hide, most of us would hide that family member. But then let's say somebody is arrested for the same crime, falsely arrested, and the moral problem becomes, more complicated. And it seems to be there seems to be a tension between universal justice, this guy is innocent, and loyalty to your son or to your mother, who you're hiding at home. And then Rorty says something that is very troubling. He says, well, it depends on who that other person is. If that other person is your neighbor, it's very difficult to, protect your family member. But if that person is from another race or religion or class or country, or you don't know him or her at all, then it might be easier for you to say, or to protect your family member. Or even if a neighbor knocks on your door and asks you for a couple of eggs, you would give him eggs, in normal times. Maybe during shortage, you would not. Or he says, we all agree that vegans have a point, even if we are not vegan, they have a point. But if we discovered a disease that doesn't kill cows, but it kills human beings, we would all happily participate in the Holocaust of all the cows in the planet, and we wouldn't care because protection of the species would trump.
That happened with bovine spongiform encephalitis, mad cow disease in the 90s. We killed the cows.
And his conclusion is that there's no tension between justice and loyalty. There's just larger loyalties. And
expanding, we can expand the circle of our loyalty. I'll tell you something about. I've never said this to anybody. And I don't know what it means, but it's always stuck in my mind. But I remember when Richard Rorty came to the University of Essex it must have been maybe 1993. Kind of at the peak of his notoriety. Contingency, Irony and Solidarity had come out in whatever that was, maybe 88, 89, and that book had been widely misunderstood, and he was, criticizing the Foucauldian left and different things like that, and causing trouble. And everybody hated Richard Rorty. I was quite sympathetic to what he was trying to do. Anyway, he came to the University of Essex, and he and this was also, think about the early 90s. This was at the end of the period when there was a book written. Who wrote that book? Rising Sun. It was turned into a movie about the rise of Japan. In the 80s, we find this hard to imagine. In the 80s, China now was Japan. Right? Japan was the rising power, and Japan would conquer the world. Japan had kind of found out the secret of they copied the technology, they'd done it better, they'd building motorcycles, electronics, and the Japanese were going to take over the world. And this was a kind of fantasy. So the fantasy that the Chinese, the role that they have in the Western mind was played by the Japanese. And I remember talking to Rorty at dinner, or it was a lunch, I think, or maybe it was an early dinner. It wasn't very entertaining. And he was a very kind of, he was depressive and not a good conversation partner. And this was, a dinner he had to take part in. He'd given this big public lecture at Essex, and he clearly wanted to be somewhere else. And we were talking. I was sat next to him at dinner. I was trying to talk to him about this and that. Japan came up, and he said something like, the Japanese, I hope the Japanese don't take over. And I think I said something, why? I said, well, I just don't like them. Just don't like them. And I thought, oh, yeah, you're racist against the Japanese. And what he was, and he probably was, this is probably a memory of the Second World War and the way that played out in the American mind in the decades after the Second World War. But the idea of loyalty, I think, is important. But the only way in which justice can make sense to us is in terms of how it is felt, in the heart, in how we actually conduct ourselves. This is why the problem with universalism isn't universalism. The problem is can you combine universalistic ideas of justice with structures of feeling, with how people actually and structures of feeling which motivate people to act. This is the problem of morality. Can you combine rationality with passion, with interest, with motivation? And Rorty, has his own way of dealing with that, which is to he's a liberal in the sense in which the worst thing that can happen is cruelty, and we have to be directed towards others and to try and minimize cruelty. But the idea that could be some universal aspiration is empty, because it has no visceral feeling for us, because the Japanese, who knows what they think? They could be thinking something quite different, and we don't know what they think, and it's not really our concern. So I think there's a kind of I think some of that has returned. Maybe it's never gone away, but we feel that. Who do we trust? Who do we feel loyalty to? I think going back to the European Union. I mean, if the European project had been successful, then we should be feeling loyalty towards the institutions of the European Union at this point of a public health crisis, but we're not. So therefore, that's a failure.
For me,
we go back into these kind of atavistic feelings of nation or locality,
Well, what interests me of Rorty in general,
I do care more about people in New York than I care about people in Cincinnati, because they do feel more abstract to me. Do I care more about people in New York than people in Barcelona? I guess so too. But although I do feel like I do feel an affinity with Barcelona. but these are really tough moral choices which we actually have to face.
What interests me, Rorty gives us a set of tools that allow us to feel that we don't like Japanese people or people from Cincinnati. Japan is not the point here, because he frees us from the need to have universal moral values, right? He says, don't try to have a kind of moral system that could be applied everywhere and has this kind of superiority that universal things tend to have. Just you have your own lifestyle and set of moral values. Go there and say, look, this is what we've done and it's worked for us this way. If you want to copy it, you're welcome. If you don't want to, it's fine with me. I mean, I wouldn't interfere in your affairs. And I think that's an interesting way of, allowing yourself to accept that sometimes some people you don't like. But that doesn't mean you have to be cruel to them or fight them or convert them into your universal religion or anything like that. Of course, that has limits, and we've discovered them, since Rorty died. But still, I think there's some truth in that, and I think that the deeper truth that kind of reflection is trying to unveil is that you say we're going back to some atavistic feelings of, say, brotherhood or whatever with our fellow countrymen or countrywomen. And I don't think it's atavistic. And in that sense, I think Rorty and Walzer, for example, they are right when they say, before you get to the ethical mindset, before you're willing to find a compromise with people that think differently than you and all that, you need to have your own moral structure. You need to have been brought up in a religion or an atheistic home or whatever, utilitarian home or Kantian home or whatever. And unless you have that strong, thick set of values, you cannot go out and find a thin way of relating to others.
Yeah, it's a good way of putting it. Yeah.
I don't know. I think that's something that's been revealed in a way.
I mean, for me, just to give you an idea of, the way I think about these things is, I'm attracted to Rorty's view, more as I get older, I suppose. I mean, it's a very important and compelling thinker. Anyway, but the point is that I've also been someone that's been very important for me, and the way I think about these questions is Rousseau. And what people always get wrong about Rousseau is that Rousseau was some kind of universalist. He had universalist ambitions, but the point with Rousseau is the building blocks of morality. The building blocks of morality are what Rousseau called les mœurs, morals, mores, as they say in English, mores, morals, habits, dispositions. And the basic function of any society is to inculcate morals into people, and therefore, if you're concerned with questions of morality in relationship to social life, then you have to identify those moral structures, describe them as, because they're the thick structures that people actually feel and they live with. The question of politics for me is how you can bring those thick moral structures to bear in relationship to questions of justice, as a universalistic ambition. Can you combine an idea of legitimacy, of being governed, because that's Rousseau's question. The question of Rousseau isn't really the question isn't what is justice. The question is, can there be legitimate institutions in society? And legitimacy has to be based on some idea of the general will, some idea of a social contract. And in order for that legitimacy to be constructed, it has to be based on what people actually feel and what people actually live, and that's those are their morals. So wherever we begin moral thinking, this is, I think, going back to Rorty, we have to be able to bring together issues of loyalty, which is a moral notion in that sense. It's a thick idea, with an idea of justice. And I think that's entirely possible. I think that, for me, I see, say for example, something like socialism, as socialism for me comes out of a thick set of moral dispositions and habits which were inculcated in certain situations, maybe in certain classes. And I'm thinking here about the emergence of, say, the the working class in England in the 19th century. And it becomes a question of how you can then make that effective, make that operational in a context without it becoming abstract. And the problem, I mean, this is coming back to the virus issue, is that I think that I guess one thing that's been on my mind is the way in which much of what was being talked about in places like the United States over the last few years, issues around things like identity and trauma and things like that feels suddenly kind of irrelevant. You know, a whole kind of area of debate just seems kind of irrelevant, because here is something which has shown up, which is novel, a virus, which has devastating effects, and the point is to defend ourselves together, to defend ourselves against it and organize ourselves in a certain way. And suddenly a different set of imperatives seem to be effective in us, which are more existential and felt, you know, for me. I think there was a kind of idea of we were living with the illusion of an idea of the self, which was protected, invulnerable, able to make choices, kind of hiding behind its bubble of its prepared bubble of how it looked to the world through its Instagram profile, and they could then, you know, be outraged by something or like something, and suddenly that bubble has been penetrated by this force of reality. And I think that's changed a whole set of priorities that we have. And I think that to that extent, what's happening is good.
You said, I'm glad you opened this topic. I've heard you say that you consider yourself an existential phenomenologist. You say you're the last one of them.
Yeah, dying species.
You've published 2 articles these last weeks. One in the New York Times and one in the LA Review of Books that was premiered in Spanish by a philosophy website here and was widely circulated in social media. You seem to be saying, contradictory things.
Different things.
You seem to be saying opposite things. So, for example, in the
as Whitman said, "Do I contradict myself? Then I contradict myself." I've always admired kind of thinkers that contradict, like Nietzsche. Nietzsche contradicts himself. So what? You know. So yeah. So I take your point. Okay, go on.
Well, there's this saying that says that less than 5 contradictions is dogmatism. So
okay, yeah, right.
You can use that.
I was so it's a kind of, how would I put this? I mean, my moods have shifted over the last weeks, as I'm sure yours have, and our moods have changed, and it feels very much here, here that to some extent, it often feels like that. New York is a strange place, at least if you give yourself over to the fantasy of New York, right? That you're in this place which is larger than you, that is a kind of, which feels things. And moods have changed here over the last weeks, as I'm sure they've changed everywhere. And you feel as if it feels like everybody's feeling the same thing on the same day. And then the next day they're feeling something slightly different. And then the day after that, they're feeling something slightly different again. But they're feeling that kind of collectively in a way that they're not in control of. Okay, so...
Just let me add something to that, because I think it's interesting. Yeah. I follow on Twitter, many New York Twitter accounts, and also European, Italian Twitter accounts. And for a while, it was as if I could witness my previous week and my following week. I could see people in New York saying the things I was saying a week earlier with the same mood and the same, tranquility of mind.
Yeah.
And then I could see Italian accounts completely depressed and, beyond tired. And it was like in the middle, and then time moves and my Catalan Twitter feed moves with me. And then New York is coming closer to where I was last week, and Italy seems to be stuck in the same depressing mood that we all seem to converge to. And it's a weird experience of simultaneity. I don't know how to say this word.
This is very interesting. There are we're even it is impossible to imagine this situation before you've been in this situation. It's just and that's a big philosophical problem, because what we're saying is we can't really, unless you're actually in a situation of this pandemic, or as say with our ancestors in situations of war, and we like to think that we like to think, for example, we like to think that we can imagine what it would be like to be, in 1936 in Barcelona, right? We like to imagine that, but obviously we can't. It's a kind of fantasy that we have, and until you're in that situation, you don't know what it's like. And so, I remember, my Italian friends living upstairs, and they were giving me, very accurate Marxist analyses of what was happening in Italy, and very carefully reported. And I was told that, and I read that, but I didn't feel it until it began to happen here, and then it began to happen here, and it was different. So, and that's kind of happening, what's happening right now tonight, very late. Oh, it's April the 17th now. It's what I'm feeling. It feels abstract to somebody in Cincinnati or somebody in South Dakota. Not South Dakota. There's an outbreak there, but somewhere where there's not much happening. The point I was going to make was something a bit different, because you're making a different point, and I lost the track there. What were we saying?
No, the philosophical problem was...
Yeah. So and also there's a kind of esoteric, exoteric distinction that maybe I could explain this in those terms. Leo Strauss has this distinction between the esoteric and the exoteric. I don't know how valid that is, but the exoterically, I felt that the Times piece, I was talking with my editor, and I thought, I said to him, I could do something funny, and he said, no, that would be a mistake. You should make it
heartfelt,
like this. Try and. So I did a kind of a straight piece, and I'm happy I did that. And it was. But then before I wrote that, I wrote this. Slightly more, satirical piece that came out in the LA Review of Books. And,
irreverent, you can say.
Irreverent, yeah, because I was very irritated by the responses that some philosophers have made to the pandemic, which seemed to be kind of opportunistic and narrow. And at that point, a couple of weeks ago, I still think this, I was... the only thing which really made sense to me in relationship to what was happening was through kinds of really quite dark humor. This is an interesting thing that there's been the story of this pandemic, which has developed in the way it has, and there's been this kind of circulation of memes. This is interesting. This is a kind of a novel, creative way of kind of releasing some of the tension. And And so there's a need for that, and that's not just nothing. I think that's also significant. I think there is something about how would I put this properly? I think that obscenity, repeated obsessively, can lead to a kind of purity of aesthetic form, which has it does have an almost transcendent effect. I think that can be done, and that's so. It's not that I'm kind of in favour of jokes in poor taste, but I think there's a kind of, at this point, maybe we also need a kind of delight in language, a kind of irreverence. It's not just to kind of find ourselves a bit more ridiculous, and also to, I think there's something going on in that.
In a way, so the contradiction I see between these two articles is that in the New York Times article, you're saying something like, if philosophy teaches you how to die, well, and following Montaigne and Cicero and Socrates, you say learning how to die well is unlearning how to be a slave. So it's important. It's important. Let me quote you just to say it, how you say, the consolation of philosophy in this instant consists in pulling away from the death-denying habits of normal life and facing the anxiety of the situation with a clear-eyed courage and sober realism. While
I believe that.
It's a good. It's a way of looking at philosophy. It's a very intimate way to looking at philosophy. It matters to you because it frees you from some chains, and that helps you live a better life, better in the best sense of the word better, right? It's like, it's the best better that you can have. While on the other piece, you seem to be saying, I can grasp the irony behind it and the criticism of Agamben and Zizek and all those philosophers. But there seems to be some despair in it when you say, as if it's useless, it's fruitless what we do. It doesn't make any difference. You say in the piece that if you had been a hairdresser like your mother or your sister, you might have been more useful in this pandemic. I don't know if those two thoughts, I don't think those two thoughts are contradictory in the sense that I think you can have both thoughts in your head and that doesn't cancel your life. But still, it's a difficult choice. Either what you're doing matters, or the only thing we're doing here in this conversation is just content because people are bored and we need to give them content.
Right.
So are you of a split mind in that? Are you like reconciling?
Split mind. I'm a completely split. I mean, I feel on the one hand that I can. On the one hand, I feel, well, I've got things I can say which would perhaps help. And I'm pleased about that. On the other hand, I think that's completely narcissistic and pointless. And if I were a proper human being, I'd be doing something useful and actually taking risks, and I'm not. And, a friend of mine, actually more than a friend of mine, my ex-wife, who is another story, is volunteered to work in a mortuary, in a morgue, in a hospital in Brooklyn, and she's been there for a couple of days, and I think I should be doing that. I should be, getting in there and if you're. It's better to be, don't be good, be lucky. And the sense the flip side of this self-isolation, which we can feel good about because we're being told to do it, is that, a credible feeling of uselessness. and superficiality. And I think that maybe I should be doing something more significant with my life than sitting at home, you know.
I was thinking earlier today that I was bathing the girls, and I thought, you know, I have hot water when I need it. You know,
Yeah.
electricity is working. I have internet. I go to the supermarket and there's food. I go.
Yeah.
I go to, you know, take out the trash and the bins are empty, so somebody's collecting it, and I have no role in this. So the system is working in its basic, you know, luxuries of our time, and I, you know, I'm I'm dispensable. You know, there's hot water doesn't depend on me, electricity doesn't depend on me, food doesn't depend on me. So it's troubling. But what made me think your piece, because in both pieces you mention isolation or confinement as, you know, a good context for good thinking, right? Descartes or Boetius. But my feeling is quite the opposite, in the sense that it's becoming impossible to be isolated. So we're having this conversation. Maybe we would not be having this conversation if there was no pandemic. I'm talking to people, you know, throughout the day. I'm constantly connected. So there's no real isolation possible. You cannot shut yourself up in a room with a stove like Descartes and some cheese and butter, and you know, and think about marvelous ideas. We're asked to give content. We're asked to, you know, keep company with our ideas, and I don't know if that makes us more useful because we are like, we keep company like dogs, or the opposite. We are just frivolous, sexy pour parler people, right?
I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think that the latter option might be right. I feel, I mean, I think it's I mean, you're right. I mean, this is on the one hand, it's a perfect time to be a philosopher, and I've never felt more useless and irrelevant. And I would love to be, you know, useful, qualified to do something that I could actually do. On the other hand, you know, I then read things about the virus, and I think, well, I don't want to catch that. You know, I don't want to be sick for 2 weeks. And this virus is kind of radically free. You know, there's something disturbing about this virus. It seems to do what it wants, and it seems to do different things in different contexts in a way that, you know, if we're still around in 5 years, 10 years, and we can tell the story of what happened, I think it's very odd trying to understand how it's affected different people in different places, why it's been so aggressive in certain places and not in other places. I was talking to a friend in Greece today, and Greece is kind of quiet. I mean, they've locked down, they've shut down, but there aren't many cases. There are 2,000-3,000 cases and not that many deaths. And Spain is a disaster, and the United States is a disaster. There's an issue. There's public health issues to this. Sure, there's also the feeling that you get that this virus has a kind of autonomy. It has a kind of selective power to do certain things. I know that's crazy, because I'd be then saying that the virus has a kind of intelligence, but it seems to be acting in different ways in different contexts with different results, and we will see. And this is the way it's going to be, and that's kind of, that is the, I mean, the walking away, the lockdown in many ways now feels easy. I mean, for me it was, I don't know what it was for you, Geordie, but for me it was March the 12th, March the 13th, and then that was the last time I took the subway, and the last time I saw somebody and met somebody, went to their apartment, but they were already socially distancing. So it was a rather kind of distanced evening, but at least I went out. And then since then it's been this lockdown, but that's been, the step away has been kind of easy. That makes sense. The step back seems to me hard to imagine at this point. What would it be to be in a room full of people with your children, say? What would that be? What risks would you be taking? And what risks would you be communicating to other people that might be there? And that sense of us as contagious is, it's hard to know what to do with that.
Let me ask
this is where we're going to be for at least a year.
Let me ask you a last question, more personal. Many years ago in your office, you told me that you started out by wanting to be a poet.
Yeah.
And then, you know, when you were in Essex, I think, you switched to philosophy.
Yeah, yeah.
And now you find yourself in this, let's call it conundrum, you know, trying to decide whether your activity of like 40 years or 35 years has any value or not.
Right.
Yeah. Do you remember how you switched? Do you remember what happened in your mind when you said, well, I'm this punk, Liverpool-born, Liverpool FC fan who wants to write poetry and play in a punk band.
Yeah.
And now I'm, you know, I want to, you know, pursue this other, you know, the other side of the Platonic coin, right? Let's pursue the other side of the, of the activity.
If I'd been successful as a musician or a poet, I would have done that, but I wasn't. So
that's very Rortian, yeah.
So failure was the key. I failed as a poet, and for me, it was very clear that, I mean, I read. I was a modernist. I mean, I was, in awe of modernist poetry, and particularly people like T.S. Eliot. And then I remember reading W.H. Auden when I was about 25, and realizing that he could do everything that I wanted to do in language, and it didn't seem to cause him much trouble. And he could say things that were both poetically beautiful and very carefully constructed and significant. So I gave up. So for me, philosophy has always been the
poet in disguise. You're a poet in disguise.
It's just a failed poet. I mean, if I had the ability, I would do something else, but it just didn't work out that way. And then the teaching university became a kind of institutional refuge. So, I mean, I'm enormously flattered to be asked for what I think about anything, which is it's nice. I don't take that for granted. But if I had the ability, I'd do something else. I mean, I still. I still play around with music, and I still, but it's a question. So failure is the key. Yeah, failure.
Yeah, well, I don't want to push you into psychoanalysis or anything like that, but clearly you're a philosopher you hate the expression public intellectual, probably because you are one, in the sense that you teach at the New School, where, you know, which is an institution that has a spirit of its own, and people recognize it. You're a celebrated author. You publish in the New York Times. You edit things in the New York Times, and people ask you what to think, what to think, and what you think, and that bears some responsibility, of course, but also a sense of what you're doing with words, what you're doing with ideas, somehow is working. And I don't know if my question was also if there's, in the switch between poetry and philosophy, there's also a switch in its aims, or in its, you know, tools, or of course there are obvious tools that, you know, that are different. But
yes, no, I mean, I think it would be, a better answer would be to say, well, so for example, the New York Times piece, the way I constructed that over about a day and a half when I was writing it was very much the way I would have constructed a poem. And I tried to really pay attention to alliteration, assonance, the way in which words will play off against each other. It's just something that I try and do, and I'm able to build that into a kind of philosophical style, and I'm proud of that, and I'm proud of that. I work very hard at that, and I'm proud of it. At the same time, I think it's I don't quite believe it. You know, I don't quite believe it. I find it. So if I get, you know, she's kind of the flip side of narcissism. If you get flattered in some way, then I think, you know, the person that's doing that is crazy. They must see that this is a fraudulent exercise. So the basic idea is that you know, of fraud, isn't it? I mean, I think that the people that believe that they have a legitimate place to say what they say, I think are probably mad or, you know, psychotic. I think that I work really hard to generate the effect with the words that I can produce, but I don't quite believe it at the same time, if that makes sense.
Well, thank you very much for this almost hour and a half of a conversation.
Wow,
while we were speaking, the sun appeared in my window when we started the conversation. They're almost, I hear some noises, so I think my freedom is over for the day.
Okay. All right.
Thank you very much, Simon. I'll see you soon.
I'll see you soon.